Welcome back to Uncovered. We are following on from our episode about instructor pay wages and do they get paid fairly. And as promised, I have found somebody who can help us understand all the questions you had. So I got quite a few questions through DMs, through the Tell Us we did, and I've collated them all and tried to pull the best ones out to be able to talk about today. So today we are joined by Brian, who is a HR specialist for a company that spans across Australia and North America, as well as a pole dancing instructor, which is even better because he understands and he has worked for studios both in Australia and in the US. So welcome to the podcast, Brian.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I'm so excited. We had a little it wasn't mini, but we had a little chat last night about the topic and we dove deep into some of them. So I feel like today is going to be really insightful for all of our listeners. So yeah, so we'll probably jump in. I think a little refresher, guys, is when we did the podcast, when I did the survey, it was 117 people we surveyed and the average per hour rate came out to $34.52. And it ranged between $0, people not getting paid. And I think when we converted it to Australian, $80. So that's a huge range. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about how that applies. And as a little disclaimer, both of us are from Australia. So we have a lot of Australian experience here. Brian also brings a little bit of the US stuff. But if you are in a country that is not Australia and is not the US, it might be worth looking into, as we talk about award wages for Australia or an award, it might be worth looking into see if something exists for your country as well. Or if you know somebody in your country who can help us uncover this topic further, I would love to hear from you. Just hit us up on our DMs. So we're going to dive in. We're talking about an award wage and what it is. So this is really important because, Brian's a specialist here, but it sort of dictates what businesses should be doing from a Fair Work Act perspective. So Brian, do you want to give us a little insight to what an award wage is or what an award is and why they exist?
Yeah, so I think especially for those outside of Australia listening, it would probably be the easiest way to describe it would be a kind of set minimum wage for every type of industry. So whereas in the US, you might have a minimum wage for, that can differ by state. In Australia, it's more based on your role category and what industry you're working in. So
yeah, when we were talking last night, how many award wages did you say Australia has?
I think there's around 126. So there's quite a few.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Most jobs would be covered under some sort of an award.
Yeah. And for pole dancers, what is that award?
So for pole dancers, that is the Fitness Industry Award. So kind of an umbrella award agreement for any sort of group fitness classes, dance classes. There's actually a whole list defined by Fair Work. Those are the couple that come to mind off the top of my head right now. But pretty much any sort of fitness related job. And within every award, there's different levels. So level 1 being the most basic sort of engagement in that industry, whereas level 7 might have I think Fair Work even defines it as having a couple of direct reports underneath you, maybe some more administrative work that you do on the side of whatever fitness classes you're teaching or otherwise involved in. And yeah, that's pretty much at its basic level what an award is. And like I said, there's all sorts of different ones just depending on your job. But for pole dancers, it's definitely the Fitness Industry Award.
Yeah, and that is, I've worked in the industry for 7 years now between being an instructor and a studio owner, and we use that award to dictate what we do in our business. So when we say, why are they important? I guess it's just purely because it sets the minimum fair work set out by your state country.
Exactly. So it's basically ensuring that any employee that is covered under that award is getting paid appropriately. With that being said, in Australia, this is again probably pretty foreign for maybe some other countries, but the timing and the days in which you work can really have a huge impact on the amount of money you make. So, for example, under many awards, unfortunately, the fitness industry one isn't one of these, which we'll get into later, I'm sure. But for many awards, if you work on a public holiday, you're entitled to 250% more than just your average hourly wage. And so, the pay that you can receive, it increases if it's, in the evening. Saturdays and Sundays have different rates. So, again, the fitness award is a little bit different, but in general, that's how detailed these awards are laid out. And yeah, it's just, about ensuring that people are paid fairly for the work that they're doing.
It even goes into how many minimum hours you can work. And the fitness award is a little bit, I've worked in retail as well, which is obviously heavily unionized in Australia. So the union definitely had a lot to say about the award that governed us. But there was always a minimum of 3 hours that anybody could work. So you couldn't just bring somebody in for an hour. From what I believe and the way I've interpreted the fitness award is if you're like a level 3, 3A, 4, 4A, and maybe even 5 and 6, you only need to be engaged for a minimum of an hour. And I think that represents the type of work we do is where most studios and most pole dancing studios are only open of an evening. Mm-hmm. So it's not a Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. It's not even those hours of an afternoon. Like it's not even a 12 to, I'm trying to do my math really quickly. 8. We don't, I'm like, oh shit, how does this work? We don't work traditional hours and the need for those businesses are different. So if there is a pole dancing, like as a pole dancing instructor, and I don't know if you know the answer to that, and I do have some of this information up if we need to refer to it. Do you know what level a pole dancing instructor would be at a minimum in the award wage anyway in Australia?
The minimum hourly rate?
Yeah, like what level would they be? Because I know like a level 1 is like we talked level 1 is like reception and admin. I think it's like the level 3s and 4s where it starts to get a bit.
So it's the levels.
Fitnessy instructor.
For hourly, like assuming we're casual, which I feel like most pole dance instructors would be.
Yeah.
Each of the levels, there's not really too much of a variation. So let's say let's just talk about the highest rate, which would be 30 times more than the standard. Level 7, which is the highest, is 38.13. So that would be the most you can earn per hour as a level 7, assuming you're working on a public holiday or weekend. The lowest at level 1 would be $27.79. So it's about a $10 difference if you're looking at the maximum again. But I think the data, well, I guess I don't want to jump ahead of everything, but I think that many studios
That's okay, just let it flow.
Yeah, I do think that most studios do pay kind of at that maximum a lot of the time just to eliminate a lot of the math and just calculation that would go into paying someone the appropriate rate depending on the hour or day that they're working.
But so then I'm really curious, like if a studio pays above award wage, do they need to continuously review this? Or do they just, like as a studio owner, do they just have to make sure that they're paying based on the minimum that is dictated by their minimum wage, their award wage, whatever it is that exists in their country?
So the only legal requirement for a studio owner is that they're paying at least the award wage. And again, that will vary based on the classification or the level classification for each employee. But as long as they're paying that minimum award wage, there is no need for them to increase them, except for, the award wages increase every year. So they would be needing to keep on top of that and making sure that they're reviewing their compliance with paying the appropriate award wage every year. But if they're paying above the award wage, and assuming that that wage is always staying above the award rate from year to year increase, then there is no legal obligation or any other obligation to increase the wage in line with anything else. Even if the award wage is increased, assuming that person's being paid above what the minimum is, there's no need for them to also increase the wage, assuming it's above the minimum. I feel like that was a lot of words, but basically, as long as they're being paid above the minimum award wage, that's really all that needs to happen.
Yeah, and I think a good example of this is, I know when I was an instructor, I started in 2015 and I obviously took over the studio in 2019. And in that time, we never had a pay increase. Like, we were always paid a set rate. However, every year we would get, and they talk about this in the Australian award wage, is we would get an individual flexibility or flexible agreement. And that was where it's like the owner said that this is the minimum wage. This is what I've agreed to pay you on every day of the week, regardless. And it generally would, take into account overtime for public holidays and the rest of it.
Exactly.
And this has always put you in the best position in comparison to the award wage. But yeah, even though the award was continuing to increase, and every year when we would get this document, you would see that increase, there was never actually an increase in our hourly rate.
And I think generally most specialist sorts of roles, so I would say pole dance is definitely a specialist role, they're generally going to be above the minimum award wage, simply because the market in a way dictates what's an appropriate level to pay someone for a pole dancing class or a yoga class or whatever else you might be teaching. Whereas typically you'd see someone getting exactly the minimum award rate in something more like retail or more kind of like environments where there's many, many, many employees working the same job. So there's not really much room for someone to say, oh, well, I should be making more. And it's like, well, no, there's tons of other people doing your same job and we're paying them this. So do it. Otherwise we'll find someone else to do it.
Yeah.
But with something like pole dancing, it's kind of like, why would I get paid the minimum award rate when every other studio in my area is paying above the award rate? So.
And I think this is really important, and I brought this up in the previous episode, is somebody left a comment was like, you need to take into account the business model. And I know that to take a bunch of classes in Brisbane, generally as a student, you're paying much less to taking classes in Melbourne. So there would be this level of expectation that Brisbane instructors maybe paid less than Melbourne instructors because the way the business is set up. So Melbourne as a group might have a higher wage because your classes cost more. But we talked about this last night too. But it also depends, is the rent more in Melbourne? Like, is there a bigger demand? Like, what is the economy doing in that space in comparison to Brisbane, which is still kind of seen as this little country town in Australia? So
yeah, not as bad as Perth.
Sorry, Brisbane. I do love it.
What's interesting though is, like, just not to go off on too much of a tangent, but the rents in Melbourne, CBD especially, are actually sometimes significantly cheaper than the outer suburbs. And I think it's an effect from COVID. And I know that Melbourne, like many other CBDs in Australia, kind of suffered from, no one had a reason to go to them. Everyone was working from home. Why would you go to the city for a coffee? You can't leave your little 5-kilometer radius. So I think it's still recovering, especially in Melbourne. I don't really know too much about what Sydney would be like, but it would definitely be an interesting time to look at renting a space in the CBD of Melbourne right now. Can't say it will last very long, but at least for right now. And that goes for residential rentals as well, as well as commercial.
Oh, wow. So it's pretty consistent. Whereas in Queensland, and yeah, we're off on a completely different topic here, but in Queensland, because of the bulk interstates moves that happened because we probably had the least level, or maybe Sydney did, but we had a lot of people move to Brisbane during COVID and afterwards, like Queensland as a whole. There was a lot of people that moved here, so rent here has just like gone up because the demand is there. So yeah, we've had a few. We've had a few. So yeah, like these are all things, and I am going to do an episode later on down the track where I'm going to talk about what are the actual costs of running a studio based on my experience. I'm hoping to get another studio owner to jump on and talk to me about it, talk with me and share their experience as well. Not necessarily going to talk numbers, but I just think there's a lot that goes in that not everybody thinks about necessarily. So just to throw some transparency there on this topic, because, you know, this topic could quite easily be thrown back on studio owners and be like, well, why aren't you paying more? Or why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing that? So I think it would be really good. I'm going to try to keep my instructor lens on for this. But also my business brain will be switched on, but I will switch over in another episode and talk about it from a studio owner's lens as well. So, because I think they're all important topics, and I think it just helps us as a community better understand what's going on in our own backyard. So
definitely, and it's all related.
Yeah. Anyway, that all related. It all comes down to money, right? Yeah. And we were talking about this just before we jumped on. And if you're in a corporate world, you might be in a position where wages are never talked about. Like it's like a taboo. But if you work in government, everybody might know what you're getting paid. So very transparent. So I think when it comes to pole, I think as we can see, the varieties are so different. And if you're more experienced and you've been competing at a professional level for a period of time, you might be in a position to negotiate higher rates. And the studio owner might be open to doing that if that's the right thing for their business, if you can prove that you're going to help boost the business there. So I don't necessarily think everyone's set. But I think negotiations could potentially be open, but you have to take a lot of things into consideration and what you could bring to the studio and why that might be worthy of a pay increase or be of interest to the studio owner.
Definitely. I mean, you can always negotiate your rate of pay, even if, you know, you're on an award, yes. Chances are you'd probably be getting paid above that rate anyways, just based on your survey results. But you can always negotiate. Nothing's ever set in stone. So
I do have a question too, which I know a lot of people who are contractors, because I think in total 84% of people who responded were contractors or casuals, and that was split pretty evenly. How does this apply to contractors? Are they also, do studio owners have to pay, or business owners, because this could be related to any fitness business, do they have to still pay the minimum wage based on the award that would be appropriate to them?
Definitely. It doesn't matter what sort of engagement you're employed through. It's just about whether or not your role falls under the award category. So if your role falls under the award category, you have to be paid at least that minimum award rate. There's different,
so it'll be
different kinds of contractors. I think especially if anyone's watching from the US, you'd probably be more familiar with an independent contractor. And so that's usually like a specialist sort of skill, and you'd be pretty much setting your own rate. So you'd come to a business, or maybe a business would reach out to you, and they'd want you to, you know, teach classes or offer your services, whatever. And you'd say, this is my rate, take it or leave it. And then, you know, you'd invoice them, or, you know, they'd just pay you based on the rate with, you know, whatever. But if you're a casual employee, then you are paid on an hourly rate. You usually sign a contract, although it's not always necessary. And maybe we should define what that means. But you definitely always, in any case, have to be making at least the minimum award rate.
So for those of you who may not be sure of what you should be paid or what the minimum wages are, if you're in Australia, and something might exist in the US, so you might be able to jump in here in a second, Brian, and let me know. But in Australia, there is a calculator called the PACT calculator, which is PACT, and it's actually a Fair Work website, and you can type in what your award wage is, and then you can figure out what level you might be. Like, as an example here, I would say most instructors are at least a level 3, and that is like the employee works under general supervision. Hold on, let me get down. They might do, this one talks about swimming instructor, but then there's a 3A, which I think goes a little bit more into group fitness classes and those types of things. So that might be a minimum level for an actual instructor based on the duties you're doing. So if you're interested, make sure, for those listening, I'll make sure I pop the notes of this, of the website, in the notes, so you can go and have a look and maybe even do a quick Google to see if we can find something similar. Do you know of anything in the US for this, Brian?
There's not, because there's really no such thing. There's not an award system in the US. There's a minimum wage, and that will vary from state to state. But there's, off the top of my head, I can't really think of anything that would really be comparable. Yeah, no.
Interesting. Because when we go to like level 7 and we talk about this $38 an hour, the maximum, like with the overtime rate, it's like an employee at this level is engaged in supervising, training, and coordinating employees. So when you think about that in comparison to being a pole dancing instructor and delivering a class, maybe not everybody is at that level. So it does sound like most businesses are just engaged in this higher than, let's say, market rate, which is the market rate is the minimum.
Yeah. And I think a lot of studios will pay more than the minimum award rate, simply to avoid any sort of doubt over, it's just to kind of really cover themselves. So in the case that someone says, which I'm sure we'll touch on this topic a bit later, but I've been, doing all this class prep and not being compensated for it. They'd fall back on,
maybe we can go on a class prep next.
The award, the minimum award. The other thing is that, so maybe just quickly before I get into this, casual employees, most pole dance instructors would be considered casual. And that really just means that you work irregular hours, and it's on a casual basis. So very informal, not really meant to be a set schedule at all. And that's the gist of it, really. But on top of those minimum award rates, you're also meant to be paid 20% loading on top of, if you're a casual employee. And the reason for that is because casual employees don't accrue annual leave or sick leave. If there's a public holiday, there is no public holiday rate for fitness award employees, especially. So, but even if there was, you wouldn't be expected to work on a public holiday. And if, you just don't get paid to have the day off, like a full-time or part-time employee would. So that loading is there to kind of compensate for those other areas which you wouldn't be, receiving annual leave or sick leave or public holiday days off. So, again, it makes sense from a business perspective for studios to be paying above the minimum award rate because A, they have to include that 20% casual loading, but B, just to kind of make sure that they're capturing all potential hours that instructors might be working. I mean, like you said earlier, many studios are most active on the weekends because that's when most people are off work. So those are higher rates ordinarily. So just to make sure that there's no doubt, I think that's why we do see such a big market allowance, I guess you could say, for pole instructors.
And I know when I was initially coming onto, we'll jump into the class prep conversation next because there's definitely a lot of people talking. And I know when I initially was getting paid, when I was getting paid a higher rate because we did have contracts and our contract stated that you are expected to prepare your classes outside of this. But I just assumed that was why we're being paid a higher rate to account for that. And I know when I put the sticker up on my Instagram stories and asked people how they felt about instructors not being paid for class prep, a lot of people are like, it's illegal. It's this, they should be paid for it. It takes a lot of work. It's like the bulk of the time. They were the sort of comments that were coming through. And there was one comment that said, hypothetically speaking, like this should be included in the hourly rate.
Mm-hmm.
Because how do you calculate class prep?
Exactly,
But
yeah.
from a legal perspective or a fairness perspective, what is the stance on that? Because I know I was talking to somebody recently, and when I said to them the conversations I'd been having, and they're like, oh, well, I'm pretty sure across the board, whether it be yoga, Pilates, group fitness instructor, there isn't a lot of prep because you're expected to go, not expected to go on the fly, but you do that as you're going throughout the class. And, you know, some studios do have curriculums which are all set out, which you don't actually, you might need to learn a bit of choreo, but you don't have to fully prep for.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, let's talk about what should happen or not happen, or our thoughts. Let's just go our thoughts on it because we can't give full advice here. But yeah, what are your thoughts on class prep?
You know, I think you have to be realistic about, you know, the amount of time really that you take to prepare for something. So if you're getting paid, let's say, $35 an hour to teach the class, do you really want to spend like that much time preparing for it? So not to say that you shouldn't put in your best work, but more just, you know, thinking about being realistic with, you know, your return on investment with that time. As far as, is it legal? Well, I mean, if you could always make a claim for underpayment, at least in Australia through the Fair Work Ombudsman. But whether that would really stand is debatable. And I guess it would vary just on a case-by-case basis based on the work that you were doing. So whether it was just class prep and, you know, creating a choreography at your house or studio time, or if it was maybe something bigger, like you were planning a curriculum, I mean, that might be something a bit more serious that might have a bit more weight to it if you were to make a claim for underpayment. But yeah, I mean, from my personal perspective, like I'm an instructor in Melbourne, and I definitely teach choreography classes, and I will prepare a little bit before the class, but I would never put in so much time that, you know, it just didn't make sense based on the amount that I was getting paid for it. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, and my thoughts as an individual, when it's come to class prep, I literally have books upon books of classes that I've ran, like since being an instructor. And I regularly go back and reuse them, or reuse versions of them. I will flog the same choreo like 3 or 4 times. I might put the same one, but with a chair, or the same one, but instead of tricks on the pole, on the floor. And I highly encourage instructors to do that if your studio will allow that. I do know studios will go, we pay higher for this. They give free use of the studio as a benefit to help you class prep. So that's like that. Look, we know you can't do this at home. Have the studio. Don't worry about paying for the electricity, the whatever else goes with you being there. In terms of whether we should include it, my first thoughts are, like my business brain goes, have there been any legal situations and taken to court like this? Sorry, this is my MBA talking. And what was the outcome there?
Yeah.
Like, how did that stand up? My second one is, what happens in yoga? What happens in Pilates? And if you guys have the answers to this, send it through, because it was some research I wanted to do. And I did a bit of Googling, but I want to talk to somebody about it. Fitness classes, like, are you paid for the class, the prep time as well? Because I don't feel that we've just created, as pole dancers, we've just created this thing where we don't pay for class prep. I feel like it was taken from another industry when somebody's gone, okay, how do I pay? It's like, okay, what is the fitness? What do gyms do? Or what's my experience being a PT? Like, did I get paid that extra time? And I don't know what those setups are from an employee perspective. The one thing I do think is, if we introduced it, how do you do that? Like, I know I've had conversations with people who are like, I can literally create a choreo in my head on the way to the studio and deliver the class. And then I've had conversations with people who have said it takes them 2 to 4 hours to create a choreo. So how do you then, as a business owner, go, okay, I'm going to start paying you guys class prep, but I'm going to put my lens on it. A lot of people, I do really want to throw out a lot of people who I spoke to or who did come through the survey. A lot of people did say they get paid more for a choreo class to compensate that prep time. Like it's a different rate, which I think, like, when I think about that logically, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Like if you're doing that extra work, and choreo is probably the most time heavy commitment based on the classes, the types of classes we teach, then I think that is a good idea. And if you're a business owner,
that, though, like,
that could be a way to do it.
With that, you might want to be careful, like, to have such a policy in which you pay a little bit more than a normal class to teach a choreography class to capture any other hours needed for prep. Because if someone were to make a complaint about that, they would say, well, it was 2 hours worth of work. And then you'd want to make sure that whatever rate that you were paying them, you know, divide that. Let's say it was 2 hours of total work. So 1 hour for prep, 1 hour for the class.
Yeah.
Divide that figure by 2, and you'd want to make sure that that was at least the minimum award rate for both of the hours worked, if there was to be a claim.
Oh my God, this just gets complicated.
I mean, it might not be this complicated, but like, I think by you acknowledging that there's more work that goes into this particular type of class, you're acknowledging that, you know, how do you define how long that is that you're paying someone to prep for the class? Like, so are you saying it's in hours of prep? What I would do is I would say I'd pay you for an hour of prep and then an hour for the class, just to make things super clear. So that way there's no expectation on the student or the instructor to be spending any more time than an hour prepping for the class. That's what you're paying them for. And it's very clearly defined that you're paying them in a fair way. I guess that would be one of the things that comes to my mind. I mean, whether or not it's actually a tangible issue in real life, you know, I don't think the average person would really care or investigate too much into that. But, you know, it is kind of a gray area there, I guess, in terms of unpaid labor, or whether someone considers what they got paid for the prep enough, you know.
Yeah, and I think that's the hard part. So I guess even in saying that, if you're like, I pay you above a market rate, like let's say I pay you, I'm not going to put figures on this, like I pay you this much and this incorporates your prep, then it's like, how do you work that back to be like, how much time is prep?
Yeah,
so
you want to define it.
This is a really tricky one.
If you're going to acknowledge it, you might as well just define how long it might be, just to avoid any confusion.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. All this makes me want to, like, my feeling of what I need to say here is, if you are a studio owner, probably worth like having a chat to a HR like lawyer and being like, oh, you know, just your lawyers in general to be like, are my employee documents correct? Like, am I protected from this based on the way that my business works? And it's I know for business owners and studio owners, it might feel like a huge investment for nothing, but it's insurance essentially.
And it's something
like
that you could only review on like a yearly basis. You know?
Yeah. So that would probably be my recommendation to studio owners. If they can take anything from this, it's do your research and see what it is. And we were talking last night, and you're like, a lot of the times, most instructors are like, cool, like I feel like I'm compensated well enough. Like they don't think too hard about the prep element. And apart from the stories, I don't remember there being anything in the survey. There may have been 1 or 2 comments about class prep. So yeah, I mean, it just depends how people feel about it.
Yeah, I think it's
interesting. I feel like that's a can of worms we're opening here.
Yeah.
I'm like, as a studio owner, I'm trying to keep my studio owner hat off here, but as a studio owner, I'm like, this just keeps getting more complicated. But I mean, if you set it up right, it's just, you don't want to be doing the wrong thing.
Yeah, but it is complicated.
Yeah.
You know, and it's not just, you know, the awards and fair work and all that, but also like payroll is really complicated. And it's a lot to manage, especially for work.
In Australia, you also pay Yeah, and in Australia, you also pay 10.5% superannuation. So not only are you paying, the, let's say, $40 for your employee now, you're also paying them $4 an hour for them later as well. So for those of you who aren't Australian, superannuation is like a retirement fund. All businesses are required to pay to their employees. And now there used to be a minimum on it of you had to earn $450 a month, but they've now removed that. So regardless, you're in Australia, your employer has to pay 10.5% superannuation on top of your
every
wage.
year for the next couple of years until it gets to, I think,
is it yearly?
Maybe it's 11% or 11.5%, or maybe it's 12%. Don't quote me, but it will be increasing every year until it gets to a certain number. So when I think 2 years ago it was 9.5%.
There are other things to take into consideration.
Yep, and so.
Well, when I brought the studio, it was 9%.
Yep.
And now it's 10.5.
And now it's 10.5, yeah. So it increased 0.5% this financial year. And for anyone else outside of Australia listening, financial year runs July 1st through the next year, June 30th. So.
Yeah, because the state is calendar year,
Dates
isn't it,
calendar
for their financial
year.
years? Yeah. Also, to throw that out, like just a random side note, banks run their financial years from like 1st of September to the 31st of August, just to make it even more difficult, regardless of where they run their things. I know, it just, as a normal person, you're like, this is my financial year.
I don't get it. It really just
organization
doesn't make sense, but I guess like, it is what it is, but I prefer calendar year for sure.
Makes so much more sense. So like on top of that, thinking about that, if your total package is not just your hourly rate, it's your hourly rate plus 10.5%, which is the commitment from your business. So putting that into perspective too, I think is important to really highlight.